Welcome to Groovy Town. Today's video is all about a very groovy move, spikes. Some players, such as myself, make up for their lack of skill by stacking so many layers of spikes that it compensates for the difference. But that's not what we're discussing today. Today we are discussing the lengthy, complex history of this move. And it might go on so long that I might have to split this into two parts, which is a thought that is just delightful to me. Because this move, we kind of take it for granted, and we never really stop to think, oh my god, this thing's fucking incredible. It's so many applications, a lot of what Spikes brings to the table is a lot of what competitive Pokemon is about. Like jokes about skill or whatever, managing it, playing it against it, using it. It's a lot of what comprises good team building and good playing. And I think that's excellent because I like elements that bring out the skill possible in Pokemon. I think, you can also say, you're just going to get your spikes up with Skarmory and Whirlwind around a gajillion times. Real skillful. But I think it's a lot more... It allows for a lot more potential skill than something like, clicking U-turn and Volt Switch into oblivion. Not to rag on Generations with, U-turn and Volt Switch, obviously. But you can tell the difference. I told myself this video was going to be more concise. And I am going to try and not go on 16 million tangents. I've been getting a lot of comments, you should use a script. And that's why this video is not the video about the blue incident, because, I heard you. That video is going to be a film. You want script, you want editing, I will give you cinema. But it also means it's going to take a while, as opposed to my usual dumb guy routine of, I'm going to fire up the computer and I'm going to ramble into the microphone. So, let's get down to some spikes. So, GSC, we are not just going to go over, this uses spikes, and then, that's it. It's like the spikers of each generation. Skarmory, the end. But we're going to go over the spikes users and the anti-spikes methods, because most people, you don't just say, spikes are up, that's that then, I guess I'll have to deal with it. There are plenty of ways to deal with it. And of course, spikes abusers. And this one's very important, because sometimes you think, what goes well with spikes? And then you think, everything, obviously, like spikes digging into its counters, what kind of a question is that? And you think, okay, that makes sense. But this is why I think spikes brings out good team building, because let's take the example of Advanced Heracross. Pretty much everything that checks Advanced Heracross is immune to spikes. That's, Salamence, Gengar, Zapdos, Gyarados, more stuff. Like, obviously, there are some Pokemon that are faster than Revenge Killer with Psychic, but you're not hampering, or Skarmory I didn't even mention, but you're not hampering Heracross's checks' ability to switch into Heracross with spikes, right? So you think, I'm just going to throw out some spikes, then I'm going to throw out Heracross because it's really strong, it's going to weaken stuff for it, and it's like, not really good synergy. I'm not saying that you can't slap Heracross on a spikes team, but there's a reason why most successful teams with spikes don't have Heracross and vice versa. So, there are some Pokemon that are just better at abusing spikes than others. And that's why this goes to a competitive idea in general. Sometimes people say, why do all these teams look the same? And that's true for a lot of spiking-centered teams, especially in old generations. It's like, because these are the best Pokemon at doing so. To use another Gen 3 example, why are Tyranitar and Aerodactyl and electric types such good spikes abusers? Because the one exception is like Claydol and sometimes Flygon, if there's no ice moves. But that's the whole point. They're the exceptions. Pretty much everything else, every other check to T-Tar and Arrow and Electrics is grounded. So you are pretty much guaranteeing, either if they switch to their counter, then they're taking spikes damage. That makes them easier to work around. Gengar, another great example. Stuff that uses coverage against flying types and Pokemon with levitate, but mostly flying types. So ice and rock and electric. Kind of follows that these things have synergy. So it's not as simple as, oh, well, I'm going to use the spikes and, OHKO everything with my +1 attack thing once the opponent takes 12% damage, half of which they heal off with leftovers. Obviously, it helps, like with damage thresholds and everything. And that's where we get into the element of using skill in the battle, having to consider the damage threshold that spikes pushes over. To use yet another advanced example, with spikes, then even defensive Swampert really does not like switching into CB Salamence's HP flying on. It doesn't get to heal as easily with leftovers. It's really getting into dangerous territory. And so that's why a lot of teams will have stuff like T-Tar or Metagross or Jirachi to back it up against those CB HP flyings it doesn't actually resist. And then CB Salamence can take this further. Oh, well, maybe I'll go throw out an Earthquake because it hits Swampert almost as hard as HP flying, and it also slams those common HP flying resists. I mean, a lot of players, when they see a CB Salamence, then they'll be like, oh, well, I'm going to switch to Jirachi or Metagross early on because it's going to take the HP flying, and there's no way you lead off with EQ, right? And therefore, EQing first is a heads-up play. It is an example of skill. And we can go on like this forever, but I wanted to demonstrate the potential for both for skill, both in team building and battle. So now we start with GSC. So Skarmory is not on the screen, and that is because Skarmory does not learn spikes in GSC, to the surprise of everyone who picks this generation up, me included way back when. So who are the spikers? Well, Cloister, I have an entire video dedicated to why Cloister is good in GSC, so I'm not going to spend time on, oh, well, it switches into Snorlax, and, Stab, Surf plus Explosion is so good, and it can also spin, because that video covers that pretty extensively. But I will say Cloister is a near automatic addition to, I'm just going to make up a number. Let's say 8 out of 10 GSC teams... No, that's too low. 8.5 at least. And then some others use Forretress, and then some others do some wonky stuff. But generally, you are going to be seeing Cloister in a majority of the... You're going to be using Cloister and seeing Cloister on the other side in the majority of GSC games you play. So Cloister is also notable because it's one of the anti-spikes methods if it chooses to run Rapid Spin. It doesn't do this as commonly because it does not have much in the way of longevity, i.e. you can Toxic it and put it on a timer. So relying on Cloister to spike and spin can be difficult in a war of attrition and in longer games where you need it to stick around and lay those spikes over and over and get rid of the opposing spikes repeatedly. If you just needed to do one, that's fine, but if you needed to do both, that can be too much pressure on it. And not that it can't be done, obviously, but you need to consider it in your team building. You need a good supporting cast. Like maybe on a stall team, you would really love Heal Bell, for example. Or on an offense team where like a Marowak offense team, like one I used to really love running, then the games move fast, so it doesn't matter as long as you can get that spin, keep Marowak at full health, stuff like that. Because I also had a Drum Snorlax, for example. So as long as you can play aggressively and play well enough and keep the spikes game in mind, then you'll be fine. But it's not something you just slap on a team willy-nilly. So most of the time, you are seeing spikes boom Cloister. And the spikes game is what we're covering, really. Honestly, the GSC spikes game could be its own video. And now I'm kind of regretting not splitting this into, like, 6 different videos. GSC, Advanced, DPP. Ugh. But we're here. We're gonna do it. So yeah, the spikes game. The layers of spikes, the removers of spikes, the abusers of spikes. That sounds pretty good. I just made that up. So yeah, Cloister generally spikes, surf, toxic, boom. And you can slot other stuff in there like HP electric over toxic or spin over boom. With leftovers, obviously, because that's the default. But some offensive teams in GSC, I started running Miracle Berry a few years ago, just because taking that Snorlax Lovely Kiss is so dumb, or that Exeggutor Sleep Powder, and in really fast-paced games, that can be good. And or even against Jinx or something. So Yeah, Cloister, that's what it does. So the alternative to Cloister as far as spikes go, well, there are two alternatives. One of them's not on the screen because you can only fit... I should use one of those... I should have put one of those boxes on Showdown instead of the team builder. But, you know, this loose style is my thing, you know, until Perfect Blue comes around. Yeah, that's the title of the blue video already, because it's going to be awesome. So just throwing off these awesome teasers into the wind and in the midst of this otherwise informational video. Yeah, I just... rambling is usually my style. Like right now. So Fori is the alternative. So we mentioned Cloister's vulnerability in a war of attrition, i.e. it can get toxic. Forretress doesn't have that problem because it is half steel. Of course, Forretress has other issues, like it's really slow, whereas Cloister is fast. Like it doesn't seem like base whatever 70, yeah 70 is fast, but you notice in games where it's outrunning significant chunks of opposing teams, just because a lot of other common offense Pokemon aren't that fast. So yeah, Fori is really slow, and it's compounded by the fact that it has a quadruple weakness to fire. And a lot of the Pokemon that it might want to set up on, like Snorlax is the big one. That's the biggest one. Cloister you can throw into Snorlax with a lot more reliability. I'm not saying Snorlax doesn't run Thunder sometimes, but it's a lot less likely than the standard fire coverage that Lex usually runs. And why does it run Fire over Thunder when both of them hit Skarmory? Well, because Fire also hits Steelix, which is another common answer. So, Fori can't switch into Snorlax as safely as Cloister because it's constantly fearing that fire coverage, and that makes a big difference, not just in your team building, but more realistically in a game sense, because in most GSC games, obviously you don't want to be too predictable about this because that is how Snorlax will exploit you with Thunder if you're too reliant on it. But generally, in a general sense, if you're just playing GSC, you can throw Cloister into Snorlax, especially if you're smart, because Snorlax needs to hit you with Double Edge and then Thunder to actually KO you with Thunder. Whereas Forretress is, even at 100%, it's in... I think it has a low chance of living Flamethrower or something, but you know, it's not something you really want to risk for spikes, which might get blown away later. No, you don't want to do that. So, with Cloister, you can throw it into Lax more than you don't. And you can rest momentum back again, so you can Toxic it, you can Threaten Boom, whatever. You can force a rest. With Fori, you can't throw it into Snorlax early in the game before you know it's set, unless, A, you don't care, or you've scouted the opponent, or something. Neither of those are reliable, by the way, and the whole idea of GSC is that you don't need to make these dumb, well, I hope my opponent's not running this, because you don't have to. But this is Forretress' biggest flaw. You can't switch into Snorlax early on reliably and lay spikes. And other than that, like, once you know the Snorlax doesn't have fire, then yes, go crazy. But you also need Toxic to actually force Lax to rest. So that's why generally the best Forretress is Spike, Spin, Toxic, Boom, because it gives you the most application in a variety of situations. Because Fori also has several advantages over Cloister, i.e. not dying to Thunder. You could actually threaten to blow up on a Zapdos. That's really, really huge. But Cloister also has more widely encompassing Stab and Surf, with Explosion covers everything, whereas you can throw a lot of normal resists into Forretress really safely and not be threatened by its boom as much. That's the problem. And yeah, you can do things like HP Ghost for the Ghost or Pursuit support, whatever. But also you really want to be running HP Fire a lot of the time for other Fori, because if you don't have a Ghost, then other Fori will just stalemate you. That's just how it is. So that's a big part of the Spikes game. Fori has to... Cloister covers a lot with just its basic moveset. Its basic moveset you can run like pretty much every GSC game for the rest of your life if you're so inclined. And just like the consistency of Rest Hog Zapdos, it's very difficult to punish. That's why it's so good. That's why it's so spammed. Whereas with Fori, you really have to be considerate of your team and its moveset, because if you don't have a Ghost, then you need HP Fire, because otherwise, how are you going to stop opposing Forretress from coming in and spinning on you forever? You don't. The most you're going to do... Like, I used to do this thing before, when I was trying to explore some ideas with team building, where Early on, the Fori is not going to spin because it doesn't just want to thud with spin into a ghost without laying its own spikes. So early on, you spike with your own Fori, and then when their Fori comes in, you go right to T-Tar as they lay their own spikes, and then you start roaring them around and pursuing the Forretress and just chipping it over and over and over. And it's a good idea to do that in general, but like if you have an HP Fire Fori and also a Pursuit Fire move T-Tar, then you can still do that. But it's not something you should rely on to remove Fori with entirely. So that's the thing. So you pretty much need HP Fire. You need HP Fire, or you better be ready to just... Okay, if you want to keep spikes, you need a Ghost. That's pretty much how it is, because there's no abilities in GSC. You can't magnet pull it or anything. So you will need to do something about actually hurting Forretress, and that's why HP Fire without a Ghost is the preferred thing. And then that HP Fire means you're not fitting Toxic or Boom. And there's some cool teams like with Forretress and Starmie, meaning you might not have to drop Spin, so that makes Fori more of a threat. But that's also another team building restriction. So you can see why Fori is not used as much. Can't switch into Lax as much, has a lot more moveset restriction and teammate requirements depending and stuff like that. Obviously, Forretress is a great Pokemon. It's an amazing Pokemon. It's just a lot harder to slap on a team and use in a battle than Cloister is, and that's why. But, of course, as a spinner, it also struggles with the fact that it takes a lot of damage from Cloister's Surf. So you can't just throw it into Cloister, take 40 from Surf as you spike, then, what are you going to do? Even if you have Giga Drain for you, which is a good set. Again, something else it would love to fit, but often can't. Giga Drain for you, great for Cloister, great for Golem. Yeah. Oh, also, HP Fire comes with the major drawback, because in GSC, your hidden power will often mess with your IVs, called DVs in the first two gens. So HP Ice is pretty much harmless because it only just brings your defense down a little. But HP Fire rips, actually you can see it on screen right now. See how Fori's max HP is 353? Yeah, you give it HP Fire and it drops to like 329 or something. Yeah, 329. That's pretty enormous. And that's not the only stat it drops. It drops its defense, its attack, who really cares. But yeah. HP Fire 4 is really good though, because it doesn't just hit, what's it called? Other Fori, but it also lets you actually use Fori to check Steelix. And that's really nice, being able to actually use Fori to check stuff. And the fire coverage thing, it's not just a Snorlax thing. Nidoking is another example, because one of Fori's favorite things is setting up on standard Nidoking with EQ, Ice Beam, Thunder, because it resists all and takes pretty minuscule damage. But then you've run into that Nidoking that doesn't want to be walled by Heracross, and also so it runs Flamethrower or Fire Blast, and then Fori also gets roasted, and just ugh. So you got to be careful. That's a lot of things. That's another move that I used to love running on Fori, Protect, because what's one of Fori's biggest issues? You want it, it's slow, but you're also relying on it to spin, right? And that's the problem. That whereas Cloister, you can be a little more cavalier with its health because of that speed. So even if it's getting beat up on, then it's fine. But with Fori's low speed, then it's tougher to get that off. So that's why I really like running Protect on it. Make up for that chip damage. Also helps with like Toxic and stuff, obviously. But again, you really got to be careful with the team to include it. So moving on, we go to the spin blockers, because before there was Defog, then there was Rapid Spin, and you could block that with a Ghost type. So Gengar. It's a good spin blocker, but it's not a perfect spin blocker. But the reason why it's the go-to Ghost of the two choices in Generation 2 is because it's a monstrous offensive threat with Spikes down. And Spike's immunity in Gen 2 is rare, because there's no Levitate, there's no abilities. So you just have flying types. And let's examine the flying types in OU. Number one, there's not a lot of them, so... most things get hit by Spikes in Gen 2. And I didn't even mention this until now. Spikes only has one layer in Gen 2. It's the only gen like that. Every other gen, you have the first layer, then the second layer, which kind of sucks unless you can guarantee the third layer. I mean, it's not bad if you can get it for free, but generally consider if you can do something else instead of getting that second layer. But yeah, the 3 layers in Gen 2, so that's why you can't just stack 3 layers of Spikes and then go to town on everything. That would be insane. That would be really, really messed up. Because it would swing the power too much in the favor of something like Zapdos, which is both the second best Pokemon in the tier and Spike's immune. So, if you watch that Cloister video of mine, then you'll notice that the Pokemon Cloister jumped ahead of was Raikou, and usually it was Zapdos then Raikou, and then the disparity between, they used to be, they're fairly interchangeable, and then as Spikes became, people really realized just how much more difficult it was to make use of Raikou in a game, not just because it hit less hard than Zapdos, I mean, the difference, come on, not that big a deal, but the Spikes vulnerability, enormous. So yeah, there's only one layer, but it does dig, but in exchange for there only being one layer, it digs into pretty much everything. Like even, I just put Gengar, yeah, even Gengar itself, there's no levitate. For newer gen players used to Curse Body Gengar. From Gens 3 to 6? Yes, from Gens 3 to 6, Gengar famously had Levitate. Its EQ immunity was one of the best things about it. But in the first 2 gens, then no abilities, no Levitate, Gengar is hit by EQ, and in Gen 2, Gengar is hit by Spikes. That's a little bit of a trip. So, yeah, look at all these flying types. You have Skarmory. Yeah, Skarmory is not handling Gengar at all. And what's the other one? Oh, Zapdos, of course. But I'll go down to BL in a sec. Yeah, Zapdos is 3-hit KO'd by Gengar's Ice Punch, which is pretty good because you can avoid a 2-hit KO. But at the same time, a 3-hit KO, especially in GSC, that's terrifying. Not saying that Zapdos can't pivot in on a T-Bolt and scare Gengar out, obviously. But, whether you're fine with opening yourself up to getting blown up on, and because, most people would sacrifice a Gengar to take out a Zapdos. But, of course, it depends on the game. But also, I'm rambling again. So, yeah, point being, Gengar, Spikes immune Pokemon. This, to use the earlier Advanced Heracross example, GSC Machamp is also massively threatening, but it's one of the few sweepers where Spikes don't really help it that much. I mean, obviously they help it bust through just the general bulk of the tier, but when your common answers are things like Zapdos and Skarmory, then are Spikes really helping you out? So, something to consider. Obviously, Machamp still fits pretty much exclusively on Spike's offense teams. Not entirely exclusively, but pretty much exclusively. Whereas something like Jinx, which is also shredding every flyer in the game, then, what are some of the other flying types you see in OU sometimes? Things like Dragonite, right? Or Charizard or Moltres, sometimes even Articuno. Yeah, these things that are weak to things like Electric, which makes things like Gengar and Zapdos premier Spikes abusers, and that's why so many Spikes teams have them. So, yeah, Gengar can spin block against Cloister fairly well. You don't want to switch it into Surf, especially with Spikes down repeatedly, but, early on it gets the job done, especially because most of the time you're not switching into Cloister to block Spin, you're switching in to block the combination of Toxic and Explosion. So, but yeah, Forretress, yeah, Gengar blanks hard unless it's running HP Ghost, which is fine, but then we've already gotten over Forretress's moveset issues. And the spinners that Gengar doesn't like switching into are Starmie and Golem. Golem just deletes it with EQ. And Starmie, for a long time, ran Surf, Psychic, Spin, Recover, and Psychic slams Gengar pretty hard. And yes, Gengar can live one Psychic, but its own Thunderbolt does not KO Starmie in return. And even if you run Thunder, it doesn't necessarily get the job done. And then there's risk. Yeah, you can paralyze it, but you can also miss. So, generally, in the past, then Spike's teams were a lot more concerned with bulky Starmie sitting on them. That Fortress stalemate scenario I mentioned, it used to be the same, but with Starmie. Because a lot of Starmie teams didn't used to run Spikes, now they pretty much always do. Now it's fairly accepted as a truism that every GSC team needs Spikes, simply because what else, you don't really miss out on anything better. Like Cloister is a top 3 Pokemon in the tier, top 3 Pokemon in the tier, and what else are you going to do? Most of the time you're going to run Spikes, and it's a big part of what generates offense because they hit pretty much everything. And its best abuser is the number 2 Pokemon in the tier. And you can tweak the number 1 Pokemon in the tier so that it can also be, like, why do a lot of people prefer fire coverage over EQ on Snorlax? Because Skarmory will never be worn down by Spikes, but things like T-Tar and Rhydon and Golem, well, Golem is something else because it threatens to get rid of those Spikes. But T-Tar and Rhydon and the Ghost types, they are hit by Spikes, so you can dink them a little with the Fire move, but with Spikes, then it'll, yeah, you see what I'm getting at. So Gengar, great Spikes abuser. not really not a spin blocker against Starmie traditionally, but it's nothing that can't be managed because you shouldn't just be fully relying on Gengar to block spin anyway. Your spiker should be able to, it shouldn't be, oh, let me get my spiker out of there immediately and go to the spin blocker all game. Now, if you're running a hardcore stall team, like with the rest of Misdreavus, which Misdreavus doesn't need too much said for it, it's used on stall teams more, and it spreads status, and it's good against Starmie. Because it's not weak to Psychic, and it has great special bulk, and better than Gengar's. But it's not an offensive threat. It's for stall teams. Whereas with so you can rely on it more, but even then, you want your spiker to be able to play the spikes game against opposing spinners somehow, because there's something called Pursuit, which T-Tar and Umbreon, and sometimes even Houndoom, but generally T-Tar and Umbreon are gonna mess with your Ghost a little bit, and we won't get into the minutia of the Pursuit because Misdreavus can run Rest to sit on Umbreon, but that's something you have to consider in your team building thing. Obviously, your team you shouldn't crumple if you can't get rid of spikes. Obviously, but it's something that you strive for, of course. But yeah, so with Gengar, you recognize this is more of an offensive spin blocker. You pivot in, you pivot around. You pivot into the Starmie spin, then you go to the Electric on the Starmie Psychic, and that's the kind of spin blocker it's going to be. Not the I'm going to sit on you forever thing of Misdreavus. So with Gengar, then you want your spiker to be able to mess with the spinner in some form. And that's why Cloister will prefer to do things like Toxic Starmie, so it has to recover more, so pivoting around it is easy. Or sometimes you don't even have to, you switch in Gengar to maintain spikes. You keep spiking, Starmie's forced to recover at some point, you switch in Zapdos, and Starmie has to choose between spinning and getting thundered in the face, or switching out and spikes staying up. So that kind of exploitability, since we're going to jump ahead to Starmie because we already pretty much covered what Misdreavus does, then that kind of potential passivity with Starmie is what moved team, because a lot of old Starmie teams didn't run spikes. And that's what moved the shift towards more spiking Starmie teams. So the Starmie team is also exerting some sort of pressure on its own without just hoping, because it used to be, we're just going to keep spikes off forever and play very safe until we find an opportunity for our Drumlax or our SD Marowak to set up. But with Starmie, but with that toxic situation where you're not exerting any sort of pressure until you can get that setup, which, not the most reliable thing in the world because it can be hard to set those guys up, then you will, needed a brain reset. So when you have a Starmie that's not exerting any pressure, then that's going to be taken advantage of by Cloister toxicking you and switching around because you're not exerting any pressure of your own. So that kind of scenario where you are forced into the same pattern over and over again with Starmie just to keep spikes off, you can't just rely on that. You have to have some way of pushing back. So that's something very important to keep in mind with Starmie. Because if you do that, then Starmie is excellent. But since you need a more specific supporting cast, like pairing it with some forms of Forretress, for example, then it's a lot more difficult to pull off. Or fit on a team, rather. But it is excellent at doing just that. It is excellent at keeping spikes off and generally being a pain if you have your own spikes. And that's when that came to really be discovered, that's when the truism started. It's like, well, even this Pokemon that was formerly thought to be exclusively spikeless, then now it's like, no, yeah, of course you can fit spikes on with it. So, yeah. Even something like SD Marowak, which was previously thought, yeah, this doesn't need spikes as much. Turns out, yeah, it really likes those extra percentages to really ensure you're dropping as much as possible without necessarily needing SD. So Golem, my pride and joy. and it spins as well. Usually on offense, EQ, spin, roar, rest, because it can't run rock slide and rapid spin. But that's fine, because in the slot where Golem goes, generally on offense you have like Steelix or T-Tar, and you will be using that as your normal resist that can also phase, which you want so you don't get run over by Sleep Talk Snorlax. Because this is not 100%, but let's say 9 times out of 10 it's the case. So, because otherwise you force Curselax to rest, and you think, okay, I'm going to roar it out now with my, Whirlwind Zapdos, let's say. And Snorlax roll Sleep Talk, and down you go, and your entire team gets swept. Yeah, you don't want that. There are ways around it, but that's something else. So you generally want that normal resistant phaser, even on offensive teams, because Snorlax stifles a lot of offense. That's why it's the best. That's what it does. So, yeah, Golem, EQ, spin, roar, boom, great set. Fits, helps you check Snorlax. A spinner that helps you check Snorlax. That's really beautiful. So then you have things like Cloister and Golem, which pair up together phenomenally because they're offensive. I'm going to have a whole video about Golem and GSC eventually. But yeah, they're offensive, and they explode, and they both check Lax, and they cover a lot together. So, yeah, Golem. More than just a Steelix who spins. Yeah, so that's pretty much the... Oh, it can also fit on Stall, obviously, because with Stall, then a lot of the time you want a check to Fire Lax, and so that's going to be either a rock or a ghost. And Golem can fit the role of the rock in that equation. And on Stall, you don't need to boom necessarily. I still like Stall teams that have booms on them, but you don't need to, so you can just run rest in that scenario instead. Or, yeah, or you can like run Curse on it. So, yeah, Curse so you don't get beaten just by Firelax boosting a million times. So EQ, spin, Curse, rest, something like that. Because you don't need to phase as much because you're going to be pairing it with Skarmory anyway. So that can be your normal resistant phaser for early on. But with Curse Golem, you're going to beat Monolax anyway. Okay, so that's... the last one is Smeargle. And Smeargle is an extreme because it has nothing in the way of longevity. So you really have to build your team. You have to either like expect that there won't be a Starmie, which is not unreasonable because Starmie's hard to fit, but you have to really expect that or have some plan around it. Like you're going to pivot into Jolteon, which is faster and which is hard. I mean, talk about restrictive. Or you just kind of have to roll with it and have. It also helps that to have offense that's pretty destructive even without spikes, and that you can punish, like if the opponent is going to slow down enough to take a rapid spin, then you are going to hit them really hard and punish them for it. So, yeah, that's Smeargle. But Spore, Spikes, and then it doesn't have a set last 2 moves. Fear like to use Sacred Fire to ruin Forretress, which I think is great, because Will-O-Wisp doesn't exist. And it's just nice to spread burns in general. It can slow down a Lax, so you're not just inviting Lax to set up in your face. You can do things like T-Wave. I think Tony used Stun Spore quite a bit because it also paralyzes ground types, so Nidoking can't be annoying. But yeah, Smeargle is hyper offense. Spikes, Spore, and then your annoying status moves pretty much, or stuff like Destiny Bond. But yeah, that's really for like super, super fast-paced. That's really exclusive. Okay, we move on to Gen 3, and this is already over half an hour, so I think in this one, we're just going to cover Gens 2 and 3. Yeah, and then we move on to the next one. Honestly, I'm kind of tempted to just cut it off here because yeah, okay, we're going to do that because I've also noticed a lot of people asking, yeah, can you make these videos just a little shorter? And you know what? If that's what you want, I'm not going to. This is enough of a ramble as it is. So we're going to end part 1 here, simply because I want to do each generation of Spikes justice. And yeah, Gen 3 alone is going to be insane because there's a lot of Pokemon to cover. So, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this first part on our journey down the lengthy, complex, wonderfully skill encapsulating... I lost my train of thought. But yeah, spikes encapsulate skill in Pokemon like little else, and they have a rich history, and they're very interesting. So we're going to be exploring them in great detail, just as we did in GSC. So, thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you next time.